number of education issues are swirling at the state and local level. The State Board of Education has to contend with everything from how to shorten up the ISTEP test, which has doubled now to 12 hours, to how to handle the Gary school system, which has been declared an at-risk school district by the state. To talk about it, we have Tony Walker, a Gary attorney who is the State Board of Education member whose district covers Northwest Indiana. Tony, welcome.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Steve.
Oh boy, there's a long list of issues we could get into. We might as well start with ISTEP because I think there's been a lot of people talking about ISTEP. The test, it's usually 6 hours. It's now going to be as long as 12 hours, and this really testing is going to start like at the end of the month, and we're only hearing about it really over the last week or so that it was going to be so large. What happened?
Well, you may just be hearing about it now, but we at the State Board were well aware, as was everyone else that was been following education issues for the last year, that there was going to be a longer test. I mean, whenever you have more rigorous standards, as we now have, as Common Core actually, we're more rigorous standards, you're going to have a different type of test needed to really test those standards. Part of the movement behind Common Core was to make sure that kids were developing critical thinking skills. So what you have now in the assessment tests, be it Park or the Indiana test now, that have been developed around these new set of standards, are tests that are no longer closed in. The tests are longer, and they're going to be longer going forward because we have open-ended questions in these tests now. So more and more, we're getting away from a multiple choice type test with ISTEP to something where kids are required to really demonstrate a certain level of mastery.
But to jump from 6 hours to 12 hours, that seems to have caught people by surprise, including Governor Mike Pence, who appointed 2 sets of consultants to look at ways to shorten that test. So it did, the 12 hours was a surprise, wasn't it?
Well, the 12 hours is not certain. I mean, no one really knows how long it's going to take to administer the test. Really, some of the experts say it would not be 12 hours. It would probably be closer to 10 and some change. It's going to be a longer test. And I think part of what people react to is the idea that kids shouldn't be subjected to long stretches. My proposal was to just offer the test in smaller pieces over more days. I don't think in any scenario that I've heard of, a child wouldn't be sitting more than 3 hours at any one time to take this test. So, as you probably know, I'm the one person on the State Board of Education that voted not to tinker with the test this
not
late.
to tinker with the test. But everybody else wants to try to get that number down, maybe to 9 hours at least, split the difference.
Yeah, and I think part of that is a response to political interest groups that, have raised a lot of noise with this, as well as to certain special interest groups such as teachers who have so much of their evaluations and compensation tied to the test that this just becomes another proxy fight in an accountability battle.
All right. Well, speaking of proxy fights, there's another bill out there that would allow the State Board of Education to pick its own chair. Right now, the chair is Glenda Ritz. She's the automatic chairman, the superintendent of public instruction. She's the only Democrat. The state school board all of the representatives are appointed by Republican Governor Mike Pence. In the end, is this a good idea?
Oh, absolutely. First of all, let me say the legislation would not prevent Superintendent Ritz from running for chair, but I think there should be a certain level of accountability to the overall board in terms of how our rules and procedures are administered. If someone is just by law the chair, then there's no recourse when the board's rules and procedures are not being followed. So the way to have that level of accountability in terms of how meetings operate and how agendas are set, it makes sense that the chair would be elected. Indiana right now is only one of 2 states in the country where by statute the superintendent or the chief school officer is automatically chair of the state board, Oklahoma being the other state.
One of only a couple of states that have elected superintendents of public instruction, though a lot of states have elected boards of education for their states. Do you think that might be a compromise? That
No.
maybe have an appointed school superintendent, but then have an elected school board? Everybody could vote on their own member around the state.
Personally, I don't think it's a good idea. Unfortunately, I think we already get too much politics into our education policy in the state of Indiana by the people that are elected. In this case, the governor, primarily, and the superintendent of public instruction and the members of the General Assembly. I think we need to be moving toward getting more politics out of the education policy business.
Do you think after this General Assembly and whatever happens that things will calm down? It's been a very contentious relationship between the governor, the superintendent, and the state board. Is there common ground there that you can see coming together finally after a couple of years?
Well, I think at a large level, there's common ground in that everyone's trying to work for what's in the best interest of Indiana kids. Now, what that looks like and how you get there, you have different ideas about that. We have several different viewpoints, even on our state board, around that issue. People tend to think, or maybe it's just convenient politically, to group all the gubernatorial appointees into one basket, but we represent a pretty big variety in terms of points of view and policy positions.
We have so little time. I want to get to this. Gary schools, they're the only at-risk school district in the state of Indiana. They've presented a plan to the state. Where does that system stand right now?
Well, I wouldn't say they're the only at-risk district in the state, Steve. There are other districts that are at risk. By far, they're the only failing district right now.
They're the only one actually designated, though, right, at this point, as an at-risk district?
Well, that was something they voluntarily entered into, by the way.
Okay.
So in order to get some additional support from the Indiana Department of Education, usually that designation is only used in very rare circumstances where there have been audit findings or other problems in terms of use of federal money. The federal government did not mandate that they be designated an at-risk district. That's a procedure they went into. But in terms of the overall issue there, whether it's Gary or any other school district in the country, the issues around education are going to have to be resolved at the local level. Gary is going to have to figure this out. The Gary Community School Corporation Board of Trustees, the superintendent, and all the elected officials and citizens of Gary will have to figure out how to improve the educational outcomes in Gary. That's really not the role of the state to come in a paternalistic sort of fashion, as we've done previously, and say, hey, you're going to do this and that. Part of what the committee I was a part of over the last several months did was to pull back the state imprint into these turnaround situations and to change it to where instead of the state is dictating to local school corporations what they need to do, we're just giving them support and leeway to figure out for themselves what's going to be effective.
Turnarounds being that a couple of years ago, Roosevelt High School was taken over by an outside operator, and they were put in charge. The state was put in charge of that school along with some in Indianapolis. You think that model just doesn't work? In the end, you can't take the school away or take away control of the district.
It's not the most effective model because part of what happens is any capacity that's built there by an outside operator leaves when that operator leaves. And what we really need to be doing, if we're going to have external partners or partnerships form around improving school quality, they need to work hand in hand with the local school corporations. And in terms of my opinion, they should be selected by the local school corporation. So what we have going on in Gary now is really positive from my perspective, because Gary Community School Corporation has made it known to the state board that they want to work with the Edison Learning on a broader program for all of the schools in Gary and not just Roosevelt.
There's some talk, though, Edison Learning doesn't want to, it's got a 5-year contract, but it wants to pull out early, that it may not be here much longer.
They've made commitments to be in the last week, that they're here for the long term, not only for Roosevelt, but hopefully for a plan to help all of the Gary schools.
But ultimately, if Gary can't improve, and they're even talking about doing a bond issue here to bring in some more property tax revenue, if they can't improve, doesn't the state have to step in at some point and do something?
Well, this referendum that Gary is putting on the ballot for an additional $51.8 million is really going to be critical, I believe, for the survival of the district. So I'm hoping for their sake that the citizens of Gary actually vote to support that. But I'm sorry, Steve, what was your question again?
If ultimately it doesn't turn around in Gary, doesn't the state have to step in?
Well, I mean, the state has to be there to provide support, but the actual work of turnaround has to start locally. I mean, the people of Gary and the elected officials in Gary have to turn around that school system. The state can't do it for you.
All right, well, that's unfortunately where you have to leave it, at least for right now. This has been Tony Walker, Gary attorney, and also member of the State Board of Education. Thank you so much for being on.
Thank you, Steve.